Okay. Hi, all. We'll just give it a 2 minutes or so here as everyone's coming in, and we'll get started. Um, can someone just maybe send me a little chat or in the Q&A, just let me know that you can hear me and everything's coming through okay? Hey, all right, I got a thumbs up. Hey, hey, Baika. Hey, Hasmig. Hey, Mrs. Meneshian. Oh, wow, great. A lot of people. Wonderful. Hello, hello. We will get started in just a minute as everyone settles in. Welcome, welcome. It's great to see a lot of new names today. Hey. If anyone would like, there's a in the chat box there, you can always send a message there. There's also the Q&A option there, but the chat, if you want to, I can see your messages there. All right, so why don't I'm just going to kind of get started as people are still coming in. My name is Arto Vaughn. I'm the executive director of Project Save Photograph Archives. We're located in Boston, Massachusetts. Welcome to another edition, our first edition in 2024, and also our first that we're holding in our new facility here in Watertown of conversations on photography. Very excited to have you all today. There's been a lot going on at Project Save. I'll talk a little bit about that. But first, I just want to give a bird's eye view of kind of what we're going to be talking about today and a little bit about the logistics. Today's talk is by Raffi Meneshian. He'll be discussing the book Under Stalin's Sun, which is a very powerful memoir by Suren Oganessian, a firsthand account of the his experiences in the gulags, escaping, and his journey that ended up in the United States in Chicago. And we'll have Raffi will present. And then I'm going to actually share some things from Project Save that are related to the Soviet gulags, and a little bit to Suren Oganessian's story. And then we're going to open it up to discussion. And the way our discussions work is that you can put your questions into the chat or into the Q&A, and as I see them, I'll be moderating them and asking Mr. Meneshian to discuss. So let me tell you guys a little bit about Project Save. I see a lot of new names in our participants today, which is wonderful. So I'm just going to very quickly give you guys an overview of Project Save and what we've been up to and all that good stuff. And then I'm going to introduce Raffi Meneshian. So Project Save Photograph Archive was founded in 1975. It was unofficially started in the 60s in New York City, but officially as a 501c3 nonprofit, it was established in 1975 here in Boston. And over these last 49 years, Project Save is now the largest archive in the world dedicated to photographs of the Armenian global experience. We have well over 80,000 photographs. And by this, I mean the actual photographs. We're not a digital archive. We do digitize the photos, but the archive itself is a physical archive. So, which is incredibly important, the fact that we have the physical photographs rather than just scans of the photographs. The photographs range everywhere from the New England region to Soviet Armenia, to Buenos Aires, Argentina, to Japan, Cuba, California, Australia. It really is a global archive that, especially starting in the 80s and 90s, as our founder, Ruth Tomasian, it was really starting to pick up steam. It really kind of exploded in terms of the quantity and quality of the photographs. Just about 6 months ago, we moved to a new location here in Watertown. This is our first public-facing location, meaning that we have a gallery, we have visiting hours, we'll be having exhibits, we'll be having in-person events. Some of these conversations on photography events can now be in person as well as being recorded or on Zoom. So it's a really exciting time for what Project Save is doing, and it's very timely because, as we know, it's unfortunately been a very, very difficult time in the Armenian world since the attack by Azerbaijan onto Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh. So it's been a really difficult couple of years in Armenia, which then, of course, resonates in different ways throughout the Armenian world. So history is kind of repeating itself right now, unfortunately, and not just in Armenia and Karabakh, but we see what's going on in Palestine. We see what's happening with the Armenian quarter in Jerusalem. We already know the kind of catastrophe that befell the Armenian community in Aleppo. And Beirut is, hanging on by a thread. So the archiving, the preserving, the documenting of original photographs is more important than ever, not just for the storytelling and to preserve the kind of tapestry of the global Armenian experience and how rich and resilient and dynamic it is, but also as just as evidence. There's no clearer, more profound, accessible, universal evidence of events, the fact that people existed, the fact that people contributed, the fact that people were indigenous on a particular part of the world. Photography is very powerful in doing that, and original photos especially. So that being said, I'm going to kind of transition now into today's event. And by the way, all of these events are recorded. We are recording today's event as well. You can, after a while, we upload them. So for example, you can go on projectsave.org, and under events, you can see many of the previous discussions that are recorded. It's also on our YouTube channel. So this will be available in the next week or two as well. So today, we have a really fascinating discussion that centers around the gulag. And for me, as I think for many, many Armenians, there's a personal element to this. I think, like with so many other Armenians, one side of my family, my mother's father, he was very caught up in the kind of idealistic, patriotic, ideological notions that were happening around the world before World War I, around World War I. He was a staunch, anti-fascist, and they moved to Soviet Armenia, like a lot of other people did. In their case, they moved from Aleppo to Yerevan in 1946, 47. And compared to Suren Oganessian's story and thousands of other stories, my grandfather came out relatively unscathed, but he was arrested a number of times. He did spend some time in a local jail in Yerevan because, of course, as soon as they got there, even though he was a diehard socialist, he wasn't a good communist, or their definition of kind of communism. He did not respond well. And so they had a very difficult time there until they were able to, in their own way, escape at a time when a lot of people didn't get out. They were able to get out in the mid 60s. So Suren Oganessian's story, I think, is really, I think it resonates, I think, with a lot of Armenians, but also it's a universal story. And it's quite epic and cinematic that he was able to withstand such brutal treatment and then live such a vibrant and life full of warmth and family, ending up in Chicago. Um, Raffi is going to get into a little bit about the history of the Gulag. So I'm going to just introduce Raffi, and what'll happen is I'll turn it over to Raffi. After about 30 minutes, I'm going to share a few things, as I said, from our archive that will connect a little bit to what Raffi will discuss, and then we'll have a broader discussion. So I'm very, very happy to introduce our speaker for today, Raffi Meneshian. He's the owner of Pomegranate Music, which is an independent record label and book publishing company. If you don't know, I would highly recommend checking out Pomegranate Music. He has put out a lot of wonderful music, mostly from Armenia, that a lot of people had not really heard before, and it's quite beautiful. As a member of the Recording Academy, he was a Grammy Award voter from 2003 to 2018. Raffi was also a full-time faculty member at the American University of Armenia in Yerevan from 2016 to 2019, where he taught in the College of Business and College of Humanities and Social Sciences. He was awarded the Boğaz Nubar Medal by the Republic of Armenia in 2017 for charitable acts and community service, both in the diaspora and in Armenia. Currently, Raffi works as a senior analyst for the global consulting firm Accenture and lives in Arizona with his wife, Natasha. Full disclosure, by the way, just to say this, Raffi is a very, very dear friend of mine. And when I was living in Armenia, 2013 to 2020, we were there at the same time. Raffi, thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Arto. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Great. Well, hey, listen, first and foremost, Arto, thank you for the invitation to be here today. I really appreciate the work that you've been doing with Project Save. And as you mentioned, our friendship goes back about 35 years now. So it's pretty amazing for us to be here together on this level. But also to the founder of Project Save, Ruth Tomasian, whose work I would say is nothing less than heroic, dedicating her life to the preservation of images and photography, and under the great care of yourself. And also to the audience, thank you for coming out today on a Tuesday to talk about gulags. So with that said, I did want to go ahead and let you know that, this particular story has been, for lack of a better word, has been kicking around in print for about 60 years, okay, and it originated with the Heidenik in a serialized format. However, I'll get into the motivations and the publication challenges probably toward the end of this particular presentation. So really, what am I going to talk about in the next 25 minutes? I would say that we'd probably want to go over a little bit of the basics and kind of give you an overview of the Gulag system. And it was a highly organized system. I'll talk to you a little bit about Suren Oganessian, who happened to be my grandfather, my maternal grandfather. And then we'll get into the book a little bit. I'll be reading some excerpts from it as well, and kind of pull some themes as to this really epic story, I would say, in a very slim 77 pages. So there's a lot in there, and it is pretty remarkable as far as what he went through. Let's talk a little bit about the gulag system, though, to start with. You know, what was it? How many people went through it? How many people perished? The gulag system itself was really started by Vladimir Lenin in about 1918, 1919, as a way of basically taking political prisoners and enemies of the state and just making them kind of go away in these particular camps. At that time, that was pretty much the primary purpose of these particular camps. As Stalin took over, and as the late 20s kind of came into the picture, Stalin decided that we're not just going to go ahead and put enemies of the state in there on real or imagined charges, most of the time imagined charges. We're going to go ahead and we're going to put slave laborers in these particular camps, expand the camps, and really, you know, work them to help modernize and really kind of accelerate industrialization at that time in the Soviet Union. So let's take a look at some numbers here. And before we kind of look at the numbers, let me just say really quickly that this was a highly organized system as far as these labor camps and the connections, and again, the system itself, highly organized. There were about 18 million people that went through, sadly, the Gulag system. This is an approximate number. My source is Anne Applebaum from the book Gulag. Also, about 3 million people unfortunately perished in the gulags themselves. And there were approximately 476 camps, let's just say 475 to 500. Within those particular camps, there were also sub-camps as well. Thankfully, the Gulag system ceased to exist and was wound down officially in 1960. However, the peak of when people were going into the gulags as slave labor were around the 1930s to 1950s. That's really when the peak of, again, the prisoners were put into these particular camps. So with that said, and kind of using that as kind of a basis, let's kind of show you a little bit of visual representation of where these camps were spread out within the Soviet Union. As you can see, there's a large cluster in and around Moscow. As you can see Baku right there. That was a major stop where people would be actually, they were basically sent there by train, and it was almost like a transit station in many ways. But look at some of the other areas, you know, in the far east of the Soviet Union. So again, highly organized, incredibly spread out, and for a while, highly effective, but really rained terror on the people of the Soviet Union. So just a little bit about my grandfather. I don't know whether to call him Suren or not, but it would be a little weird. So I'm just going to call him my grandfather. Suren Oganessian was born Suren Oganessian in the village of Shvanitsor, which is right outside of Meghri. And it's a farming community, has lots of produce. It's got this large aquifer. I was very fortunate enough to be there a couple times in the last 10 years or so. But Suren really lost his father at the age of 3. Had a hard life kind of growing up as a youngster and a teenager. He lost his mother right before he became a teenager, and was really raised lovingly by his grandmother, who he had a lot of affection for. And as you know, it took a village to go ahead and raise a lot of these orphan children. But with that said, a decision was made by the family to go ahead and send him to Yerevan as he was maturing as an adult, 18, 19, 20 years old. He lived with one of his siblings for a while, who was married, and then lived on his own in a flat, and was actually working in a store as a clerk for his uncle. So he was basically running that particular store. Now, there's some speculation whether or not he was exploited, in part because he wanted to go to college. He wanted a secondary education. He wanted to go ahead and go to university. However, he had to tend to the store and kind of, hold down the job and be able to sustain himself. However, through perseverance, he did go ahead and go to college, and I'll show you his college graduation photo in a moment. He went to night school. So very, very driven. Now, these two photos that I'm showing you right here, very interesting. The one on the left, I had never seen before. And I'm not 100% sure that anybody in my family had seen it before. And again, I had mentioned that I had taken a couple trips to Meghri somewhere around 2015, 2016. And we're going to get to the importance of how these particular photos were found and why I'm kind of putting it in here. The photo on the right is of Suren, my grandfather, as a little bit older, as a young adult, maybe in his 18, 19, 20 years old, what have you. But as I said, Suren eventually did go to college at night. He was able to get a degree. He was good with numbers. He was basically great at bookkeeping, accounting, things of that nature. And this is a photo of him in 1930, graduating from college, and got some of his other classmates around him. I find it to be interesting that the woman that is next to him, and he's in the center there, was his serious girlfriend at the time. And my grandmother, who was not that person, confirmed that. And of course, through the family, especially my mom, she had mentioned that this was confirmed as being a significant other at the time. So let me go ahead, and if I may, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to read an excerpt here as to what happened a couple months later from this graduation, because what will have happened will have affected his life for 21 years, okay? And it's safe to say that even after those 21 years are up, it probably haunted him for the rest of his life. So if you'll give me a moment, I'm going to go ahead and pull up his description of why he was arrested and how he's arrested. In 1929, in Yerevan, there was a secret rebel group to whom I belonged. In late 1930, my friends had bought a stencil printing machine and had it in my house. And we were printing anti-government booklets. My house was the ideal place for this type of activity because I didn't have any neighbors. In 3 months, we printed 2 booklets of 250 copies each, and my friends decided that I'd take them to Leninakan, which is the modern-day Gyumri, to distribute to the masses. They gave me the names of 4 people to contact in Leninakan, but unknowingly, one of those 4 quote-unquote comrades was a communist spy. On November 3rd, 1930, I reached Leninakan, and on the very next day, I was arrested by the Cheka, which is basically the Russian secret police, and sent to prison with my 4 friends. The same day, the Cheka also imprisoned my 3 friends in Yerevan. 2 days later in Tiflis, my friend Badunag was also captured. So in one night, with the help of traitor Dro Azadian, 9 young people were taken into custody and taken to Meghri prison in Tiflis, Georgia, which is modern-day Tbilisi. One of the themes of this book, and I'm going to kind of get into some of the takeaways, and the themes was travel on the train, and it wasn't leisure. I could tell you that right now. It's fascinating for how the author, how Suren goes ahead and explains the conditions of the transit to the various places that would basically imprison him. And this actually is a real Soviet car from the Gulag era that is, been refurbished, and somebody took a photo of it. And as you could see, it basically has iron doors. It basically looks like a jail cell. So once again, let me read to you the conditions of his journey through rail. The interior had equalized cages with a narrow aisle for the guards. 3 cage walls were made of steel, and the sides facing the aisle had thick iron bars, so the guard could see inside at all times. Only 2 prisoners occupied each cage during the Russian Tsarist regime, a number that eventually increased to 9 during Soviet times. With only 2 prisoners, each was able to stand, sit, and even take a few steps, since each cage just had 1 bunk. Now with 3 bunks, each prisoner was forced to lie down and face the guards at all times. Pretty brutal, no question about that. So basically at this point, he's taken from Leninakan, sent to Tbilisi in a incredibly difficult prison. So let me just kind of give you the timeline of where he went until his escape. Because in reality here, this conversation, this talk that we're going to have is really before and after his arrest and before and after his escape. So let me kind of take you through the timeline and the number of places and the places that he actually was imprisoned. In 1930, Gyumri, and then Tiflis, continued in 1931 in Tiflis, then to Baku, then to Tashkent, Uzbekistan, then to Samarkand in 1932, still in Samarkand, Uzbekistan. In 1933, in Belabi, Bashkiria, which is in Russia, in Ufa, Russia, Alma-Ata, Kazakhstan. In 1934, again in Alma-Ata, then to Moscow, then to Marinsk, Abakan, and then finally in Zablacht, Russia, which is a very small village. And this is basically the scene of his particular escape. I wanted to read to you just, again, an excerpt from the book that describes his imprisonment in Moscow. In October 1934, I was imprisoned again, this time in Moscow at the Lubyanka prison. My cell housed 12 prisoners freshly plucked from various cities. One was a Bulgarian from Odessa named Davidov. He shared that he had completed his 3-year studies at a special school and had moved to Bulgaria by way of Turkey as a special form of a mission. His profession, terrorism. He had been assigned to assassinate government ministers who exhibited anti-Soviet sentiments. In the event he was caught and imprisoned, he was to keep secret his communist identity and claim the murders he committed were for personal reasons. Only a few communists in Bulgaria knew about his mission, and he mentioned that he had assassinated 3 ministers and was jailed twice, both times escaping with the help of friends. As the police were in possession of his picture and had set out to search for him, he could not remain in Bulgaria any longer and fled to Istanbul, where he received a special visa before departing for Odessa, finding 2 of 2 friends residing there in a special hotel. The trio were brought to Moscow prison just 5 days ago. Quote, "Seems to me that there's a misunderstanding," he told me. "Soon we will be cleared and free." Now, the purpose of reading that particular excerpt is to show you, really, the types of characters that he basically was imprisoned with. And one of the conditions and kind of one of the themes of this particular book, before he was imprisoned, before he was actually escaped, was his interactions and stories from other inmates. There are several other stories, or in fact, about a dozen small little stories like this of people that he met who were violent, who had basically had unique backgrounds. So this is kind of one of the hallmarks of this book, is just straightforward stories of people that he met who were inmates sharing stories with each other. One of the other things that kind of stood out here were the conditions while in prison. It really, the food and the filth, and I'm not going to get too much into it, but the food and the filth really was, unbearable, and the psychology of survival really had to take over. So if you can, I'm going to, if you'll indulge me, I'm going to read another passage here with regards to life in the prisons. The immense prison camp was surrounded with barbed wires, walls, and guards, and was terribly filthy. The cells had tri-level bunks, and thievery and outright stealing were common Soviet practices. If a prisoner did not eat his bread ration immediately, it would be snatched from him right away. Underage prisoners in particular were prone to this practice. A large number of girls and women of all classes were in fact present, ranging from chemists and actresses to prostitutes. Harlotry was well established, and almost every girl or woman was ready to sell her body for a piece of bread. Beyond bread, 400 grams to be exact, daily meals consisted of pickled cabbage and salted fish bones. Again, some of the conditions of the camp, and really in many ways, some of the the end result for a lot of the inmates. There was a lot of desperation, obviously, prostitution, but this focus on bread, this focus on food is actually a common theme, and not surprisingly, throughout this particular account, this particular book. The scarcity of food, the exactness of the food that is given, how many kilos, things of that nature, when you're half starving and the only reason you're being given food, like a lump on a coal, right, is for energy, for you to continue to go ahead and do the slave labor work, was actually kind of something that struck me reading this many, many years later. Now, I'm going to go ahead and read really his escape. And what I want to do here is basically put this into context. Suren at this point was in the prison system for about 5 years on and off. And I say on and off because he was exiled for a little while, but it wasn't really exile. So at this point, he makes his break. He's basically saying, look, I've got to make a break now because I really can't take it anymore. I certainly don't want to die in this. So if I'm going to die, I'm going to die trying. So let me go ahead and read this a little bit to you. Late that evening, I emerged from the office with my little bag and quickly approached the barbed wires. I carefully crawled under them and hid in the thicket on the other side. The heavy rain and melting snow had produced a stream about 60 steps away that flowed northwards toward the Oyer River. I stepped into the stream and scurried away from the camp, doing so that after the guards realized I had escaped, the hounds would be unable to follow my scent. I eventually came to the road that connected Minsk with Ulaanbaatar, crossed it before landing on the riverbank. I was taken aback, however, finding the river not frozen as I had expected, but instead apparently filled with ice-cold water. When I used a long, thick branch to measure the depth, I learned the water was in fact not deep at all, as the ice beneath the surface had not yet melted. The upper layer of water had seemingly formed due to the rain and melting snow, presenting a situation that was nothing short of precarious. If I attempted to walk on the ice, it would crack and swallow me, but I had no choice. I struck the surface with the stick and tried to convince myself that the ice was hardy. I carefully crossed, but when I tried to traverse the steep bank and mountain, I encountered great difficulty. My feet found themselves buried in deep mud, and I knew it would take at least 7 or 8 hours to reach the pinnacle and enter the forest on the other side. My time was short, with daylight nearing. Not only that, but I feared that a capture so close to camp would be terrible, as the guard would return me to the barracks, subject me to physical torture, and let the dog loose on me in front of the prisoners. So, needless to say, he did escape. He did survive. And let me kind of show you the route that he took to eventually get to the northern front of the Caucasus, where he actually fought for the Red Army. It's a long story. It's in the book. He goes from Abakan, Russia, to Achinsk, Russia, to Chelyabinsk, to Kazakhstan, to Almaty again, to Rostov-on-Don in Russia, again to Tiflis, to Armenia, to Kirovbag, the modern-day Ganzak, and then ultimately to the northern front of the Caucasus. Long story short, he falsifies his identification. He basically is helped by so many Russians who really felt very, very bad for his circumstance, and actually, in many cases, laid their life on the line to go ahead and protect him and hide him when needed. He eventually is captured by German forces because he was fighting for the Red Army. He changed his names a couple times, so he had to kind of act as if. But at that point, he's captured. He's sent to Warsaw, Poland, to Ukraine, the Dalmatian Islands, to Klagenfurt, Austria, where there is a DP, displaced persons camp, goes to Germany, goes to France, then goes to the New York Harbor, Statue of Liberty, of course, Freedom, Chicago, and then eventually Glendale, California. But I do want to focus a little bit, maybe in the next couple slides, on a little bit of his experience in the displaced persons camp. The common themes after escape is in having conversations with peasants or with farmers as he was on the lam, as he was on the run, just basically fighting for his life, is how life was like before and after collectivization. Really the tragedy that befell a lot of these farmers and kind of business owners, right, before and after collectivization. He really goes ahead, and I mean, he all but says it, that he dedicates this book, all but says it, to the kindness of really the Russian people who really helped him out, whether it was with bread, whether it was basically hiding him, whether it was going ahead and kind of putting in contact him with other people that were nearby that would basically give him safe haven. And again, there is another focus on the description of food and nourishment. And while he was in the slave labor camp, while captured by the Germans, this issue of food and nourishment comes into somewhat of a grotesque form. And so I'm just going to read to you just a couple sentences here. While he's in a displaced persons camp, here we go. The Germans removed the dead and the half-dead, while the rest of us were given a half cup of heated blood as nourishment, along with some water. Now, this was the transition between being captured as a prisoner, so he is a prisoner of war, and being moved into the DP camp in and of itself. Now, while he's in the DP camp, and we'll kind of get into this a little bit, there are other Armenians around. In fact, my mother and my uncle Haik were born in the DP camp. He made several friends that he never did see again after he left those particular camps. But if you can imagine being surrounded by Armenians in a very similar precarious situation, was somewhat of comfort as well. Let me give you a little bit of a history about the publication of this particular story. This particular account was actually in a serialized format for the Hydenic newspaper based out of Boston. So this was in the 1960s. He eventually put together a collection of works, was approached by a publisher of all places in Argentina, and he collected what really is unofficially his volume 1 of thoughts, of recollections, during the First Republic, pre-First Republic, and kind of goings on in the Armenian diaspora, during his 1951 and onward experience. Then he asks Jimmy Tastian, who many of you may know, very prolific and also very dedicated person that was associated with the Hydenic and the various kind of organs there, the Armenian Weekly, the Armenian Review. And for those who don't know, Jimmy Tastian actually published a book on William Saroyan's work while his name was actually Shudak Goryan. And that was around 1983 or so. In 1984, he publishes a second volume essentially. Under Stalin's Son is also in that. Then in 2016, I was with my parents in Yerevan, Armenia, and we had made a decision that there were some things in the initial English language translation by Jimmy Tashian, not because it was Jimmy Tashian's translation, but just in the production values that we wanted to kind of upgrade and make a little bit more accessible. And so here are some of the republication motivations that as a family, we made a decision that we were going to move forward. I project managed it, kind of pushed it forward. But again, my father, who did an amazing job of a literal translation from the actual handwritten notes of Suren, the author, stripping away a lot of the florid language in a previous edition. It was a literal translation, and I think it proved to be pretty effective here. But it was published in 1981. It was self-published. We wanted to provide a modern perspective and put this particular book in context. There were some significant aesthetic improvements. And again, the translation by my father, Raffi Meneshian, who actually sadly died about 2 weeks after he finished his last sentence translating this particular book. As the son-in-law of Suren Oganessian, I know from conversations with my mom that he was absolutely fascinated with the story and was extremely, extremely motivated to go ahead and do this retranslation. We made the title accessible on Kindle, Amazon, anywhere that books are sold. One of the things that kind of motivated me as well to go ahead and kind of move forward with this project, to bring it up, to suggest it, and then move forward, is as in any family, as in any kind of group, that there can be myth making and exaggeration with regards to the history of, let's say, our ancestors, and all with good intentions. But there had been some instances where my grandfather's background wasn't necessarily being accurately presented at times in certain publications. Again, a lot of enthusiasm there. However, going back to the book, going back to his account was something that, as a publisher, I wanted to make sure I got out there just to set the record straight. I think that this particular book, this particular account, has incredible historical importance. It is the first English language translated account by an Armenian of his life in the gulags. And the importance of it is that when you think about it, this was actually written in the mid-60s. Solzhenitsyn's work, his Gulag Archipelago, had not really been translated and released into the English language reading culture until really the early 70s. So the fact that my grandfather was able to write this was unique for a couple of reasons. Number one, there was no fear of him actually writing this and going ahead and distributing it through the Heidenig. He was not necessarily, in a situation where he was going to be shot or killed or what have you, but I will make a comment at the end that could actually go ahead and contradict what I just said. But the fact of the matter is that it was a really unique time for him to be very open about his experiences. And what happened was he went from this Gulag survivor who came here on a boat in 1951. At the time, Hayastansis were not very well, I would say, welcomed into the community. It took a while. And here's a guy who worked in a factory. He took any job that he could to support his family. And all of a sudden, he writes this series of accounts that comprised of Under Stalin's Son, and the likes of a young Vahak and Dadrian, the likes of a young Richard Hovannessian, start to contact him, showing interest in his work. And in fact, when many of those people were in town or were studying in town, would call up my grandfather and ask to speak with him and have dinner and what have you. So it actually kind of made him into a relatively modest celebrity amongst intellectuals and amongst people that were reading. Here's a guy, again, that worked in a factory. But again, everybody has to reinvent themselves to earn a living a lot of times when they come to this particular country. And lastly, my motivation here in seeing this through, it took about 7 years from the time that my dad passed away and finished the translation until we've made this kind of publicly available for anybody to read, is really to kind of honor my family. I wouldn't be here without his sacrifice. We all know about the genocide side of all of our families. This is a very unique account that takes into consideration things in 1965 that were just simply not talked about. Now that there's been more research, more developed research, again, I'd really recommend that you read Anne Applebaum's book called Gulag. Now there is more of a plethora of information. There's a lot of books that are out there. But I did want to honor my grandfather and his memory, along with my grandmother, who is Austrian. And I also wanted to honor my dad, who, you know, really kind of revered his father-in-law in that sense. And I will just say, since my mom is here, I also wanted to honor my mom, because without her, this book would not have happened, because of all of the information that she gave, all of the inquisitive nature she had with her father growing up. She wrote a lot of the stuff down, and without her virtual photographic memory, I don't think we would have been able to do this. So I'll just kind of end it on this. Suggested reading, again, I've mentioned Anne Applebaum's book, Gulag. It's an absolute killer of a book. I definitely recommend it. The OG, the original gangster, Alexander Solzhenitsyn with the Gulag Archipelago. It's a must read. And then there's a book here that I threw in here that maybe a lot of people don't know about. It's from Dr. Raffi Meneshian, who I had the pleasure of meeting in Yerevan when I was on faculty at AOA with Arto. She had come in, I think, for a guest lecture or what have you. And I kind of perused through her book a little bit, and I saw my grandfather's name in there. And I'm like, whoa, okay. So you used my grandfather's book as a starting point, as an education of how Armenians basically express themselves going through the Gulag. I found this book to be extremely moving. This gentleman, Dr. Perumian's father, was actually in Iran, and he was arrested in Iran. I found it to be very moving. It does cite my grandfather quite a bit in that particular book. And I was very proud when I saw my grandfather's name in there. And I did have an opportunity to speak with her a little bit, and was happy to know that she was able to go ahead and reference my grandfather and his account as well. I'll just kind of leave it here with regards to, this is the boat that my grandfather came on from Germany to the United States. If you just take a look, peruse around, these are some of these photos. There's one of them at the bottom left is, it's a studio photo of him actually in the DP camp. The middle photo on the bottom is him on his wedding day with his bride, my grandmother, who's in the center there, and his best man and his best men. And then on the bottom right, that's my grandfather as well, in the prison camp as well, with my mom, very young at the time. So with that said, maybe I talked a little bit longer than I should have, but I really, really do appreciate the time. And Arto, I'll give the time back to you, and hopefully I didn't go too long.
It's fine, Raffi. Thank you so much. I think we already have a number of questions. I definitely have a number of questions. I think what I'll do is I'll just quickly shift over, because I did want to share a couple of things that I found in the Project Save archives. I just wanted to kind of show them quickly to everyone as a way of tying this all together to both highlight the uniqueness of Raffi's grandfather's story, of Suren Oganessian's story, but also to show, the kind of wide impact that the years of the Gulag had. So I'm just going to share gotta take out my line. There we go. Okay. Can you guys, does this look okay? Can you see? Yeah.
I can see it, Arto.
Great. So it's just a couple of slides. So what I wanted to show you here first is a lot of you will be familiar with just as Raffi's grandfather was uh, among many things was a writer. A lot of you will know the name Vahan Totovens, who was a writer born in Kharkiv in 1893. Who also unfortunately was not able to survive the gulags and was executed in the gulags in 1938. But these photos are in the Project Save archives. On the left, you see Van Totovens when he actually left America. So I mean, his story is kind of in some ways similar to Suren Oganessian's in the sense of just the epic, sweeping kind of cinematic quality of just the geography that's covered. He ends up at a young age in the United States through Europe to actually study at the University of Wisconsin. He lives in Woonsocket, Rhode Island. He's in Boston, Massachusetts. He's in New York. And on the right, he has relatives, the Keljik family. Bedros Keljik was also a writer, intellectual, and Bedros Keljik had ended up in St. Paul, Minnesota, where Toto Vance visited and actually worked in their rug store for a little while. And on the left, this is when he goes back. He leaves the U.S. He goes back in 1915 to serve, to try to defend Armenia and that region. And he becomes the bodyguard translator and one of the secretaries for General Antrani Kozanian. Here was a photo. This is a photo I found of a so-called correctional facility in Armenia. It didn't say exactly where in Armenia, but I think, as I said earlier before I introduced Raffi, I have a feeling this might be the kind of place where maybe my grandfather ended up a couple of times. Although what I think is interesting here is, of course, there's all the propaganda there on the walls about, long live Lenin and, things like that, and photos of Stalin and these guys playing chess. But I have a feeling when they weren't being photographed like this, I don't think it looked this, I don't know, calm, let's just say. I think these are men that have experienced a lot, and who knows, probably a number of these people ended up in the gulags and probably didn't return. It could be. So this family, the Gevolanian family, they are in Siberia. This is 1955. And the reason I found this photo so poignant when I found it is that this goes to show you. So here we have someone like Van Totovens in the early part of the century, or we have the story of Suren Oganessian. But here we have a family where they had gone from Aleppo to Yerevan. I can't remember now, it's either the father or the grandfather was deemed to be they on trumped up charges because he was sympathetic to the ARF, to the Tashnaksuchun. They took everything they had in Yerevan, which wasn't much anyway, because usually when these so-called repatriates arrived, usually everything was already confiscated. It's not like they let them go in there with any gold or whatever. That usually they confiscated what they had. But anyway, they sent this family to Siberia. You see the date here. I also want to show that there were still people imprisoned right until when Stalin died in 53 and a little bit after 53. This family soon after this was released. They were allowed to go back to Yerevan. Unfortunately, I mean, they had to start from absolutely zero. And then I want to end with just a couple of slides because for a few reasons. This is Shvanizor. This is where Suren Oganessian was from. And this was a trip that I was very fortunate enough to take in my time living in Armenia with Raffi Meneshian. We went together to Meghri, and then we went to Shvanizor. And I told him at the time, And I've told, I think anybody I've told the story to, that it was of all my years living in Armenia, this trip and being particularly in this village was the most, it still kind of gives me goosebumps. It's very hard to describe, but it was just the weirdest silence. There were really no people there. The Armenian census said that there were approximately 300 people living in Shvanizor in 2010, but there was basically nobody there in 2016. It was a lot of kind of half abandoned buildings like this. These are what appear to be beekeeping, beehives. This is one of the churches, again, just abandoned. But you do see, there is some probably whatever handful of villagers, whether in Shvanizor or surrounding Shvanizor. This is the border with Iran, by the way. The Arax River is very close by. There were a number of these really stunning homes just abandoned from the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. And then here, Raffi and I did come across this one gentleman who walked out of his home. He was the only person we saw in the village. It was quite powerful. And as far as I recall, I think he was a little difficult to understand. It was possible that maybe he was suffering maybe from a little bit of dementia or something like that. It was a little bit, but he did seem to kind of perk up when Raffi mentioned his grandfather Suren Oganessian, and this gentleman seemed to kind of put two and two together, but it was a very poignant experience. So there are a number of questions. You can put your questions in the Q&A or in the chat box, and I will start passing those along to Raffi as we discuss. Raffi, thank you so much. One of the things I wanted to ask, there are a couple of things.
Sure.
I think the first thing I'll ask, because someone else asked this in the chat, so I'll kind of combine it with my question. You mentioned there towards the end that in republishing this, and which I think that is a very important point, that number one, as I think as far as we know, this is the only English language first person account of an Armenian who survived the gulag. And two, that in general, this topic isn't discussed quite as much as perhaps it should be. And I'm going to get back to that in a second. But I wanted to talk about myth making because someone else asked about this, and I noticed it too when you had it in your slide. Can you maybe say a little? I mean, I know what you meant about specifically within families, of course. It's inevitable, especially in it's so many Armenian families where, and I know I keep repeating this word, but it's true that Armenian history is so cinematic because it's so full of abrupt changes and upheaval and people having to survive, but then not only surviving, but thriving in different ways. It's just so dynamic that it's inevitable that within generation to generation, stories that are already incredibly powerful kind of get stretched a little bit. So what I want to ask is not so much in your particular family's case, but because what I was thinking about is just in terms of the Armenian world, I think, do you notice anything there that you might be able to connect between the family experience and the experience of republication and the fact of myth making, but also like in the Armenian consciousness or in Armenia or in the diaspora, this idea of myth making. Can you maybe say more about that?
Yeah, I've done a lot of thinking about this particular topic. I'll talk a little bit about the family. I think it's only natural that when you have a parent or a grandparent that is gone through such an epic experience, that, especially when, let's say my grandfather, he had 5 kids, he would tell stories, what have you. And then maybe, as he passed on and people that knew him would tell stories, but they would be maybe a little bit distorted. I caught some inaccuracies with regards to some of those stories. I'll just say one. It's not a fun one, but it's cute in a weird way. Is that about how his finger was cut off. And it had been kind of told, and again, no fault to the person who told it, because it was probably told to him, that he lost it as a result of not yielding to some whim of a guard. This is what you get, when you're a revolutionary. This is what you get, when you're a rebel, something to that effect. But actually, in actuality, he lost it in an accident while he was working in Chicago. So that's one element, and it's not that it's harmless. It's understandable, because when these things happen, a lot of stories get kind of jumbled together. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's all in here. And there are a couple of other stories that are not necessarily published that go into, was he in Treblinka? Was there a gun to his head during the Holocaust, stuff like that? No. If it were, it would be in here. And those people that actively asked questions about his experience, it would have been mentioned. But again, these are all understandable situations. But where I do think myth making comes in is when I lived in Armenia, and I'm just going to be very open about it. When you grow up in the diaspora in a certain, let's say, political organization or a youth group, there are a lot of images, there are a lot of stories, there is a lot of motivation that is spun, okay? And it's all very great for the Armenian identity. But then the reality on the ground, when you're in Yerevan, that maybe that political party, maybe that particular newspaper that you read a lot, is so slanted and is so inaccurate based on what you're seeing and you're talking to people, that the danger of myth making is that it actually can divide the diaspora and the homeland to a point where those in the diaspora, and I am a diasporan, yes, I lived in Armenia and I've been going back and forth for many years, that there is quite a divide with regards to what people think, as far as our stories, as far as our importance or lack of importance, and the reality of what's going on the ground. Again, it's understandable, but the byproduct of that is dangerous.
Right. And I think, yeah, absolutely. It's not about it. Yeah, it's as you say, it's totally understandable. But I think what is important, I think that's what you're saying, is that just because something is understandable doesn't mean we don't talk about
It's
it.
not right.
Or that there isn't room for some kind of productive, critical thinking about it, around it. And actually, you got me thinking now, because I remember in Shvanizod, in Meghri, but especially in Shvanizod, I think we even mentioned we were like, well, wait a minute, this is Armenian territory here, and there's nobody here, but it's super close to Artsakh. So, and there's nobody there either.
Yeah.
So, there's a cognitive dissonance, I think, that happens.
Yeah.
And that's not always myth making. Sometimes it's a lack of information. Sometimes people just are not in touch with the reality on the ground.
Or they don't want to be in touch. Maybe they don't want to believe the reality. But again, you can talk about any political organization in the Armenian diaspora or within Armenia. It's not necessarily like specific to one. But again, I grew up in a particular culture of a particular organization, which I love, which I attribute to my Armenian identity. But when I put the reality glasses on, it just things don't make sense sometimes.
There's now kind of shifting it back to the personal in a way. It's funny. You really got me thinking about my grandfather. I grew up with stories where man, and now I'm thinking about I would be enthralled with these stories that because when these folks moved to Yerevan in the 20s, 30s, 40s, Yerevan was not the main city. Gyumri was the city. It was the cultural
Yeah.
capital. Yerevan was this muddy, ramshackle kind of town. So there would be all these stories about my grandmother. She was bitten by scorpions like 10 times, or they'd have to walk around the streets with torches because there were wolves and wild dogs. I'm sure a lot of that is true. But over the years, you start, I think there's an element of survival in that kind of storytelling on the personal level. I mean, I think among families, there's something about both the people that went through these, because we're talking about trauma here, basically. So there is something about people in order to survive and kind of rebuild a sense of self. I think some of that myth making or exaggerating becomes important, I think, to
Yeah,
tell
I
the
agree.
stories. And in some ways, maybe it's important for our generation or, as you pass it along, it gives us a sense that our
Yeah.
grandparents, great grandparents were these superhuman people that survived these unbelievable things. So I think that's a very interesting thing. I wanted to kind of mention something kind of in the book, Raffi.
Yeah, no
I
problem.
appreciate you reading different excerpts. I wanted to mention there's a number of times in the book where Suren talks about the other prisoners that he encounters. And like, for example, in the beginning of the book, there's someone from the United States. He says, um, he sees a man that was so gaunt and like he's wasting away, this prisoner. And he says he was the owner of a furniture factory in Yerevan. Back in 1925, he had relocated his factory from the
Yeah.
US to Armenia to help his country. But then in 1929, they had the Bolsheviks
Yeah.
confiscated the factory. And then there's another one where he meets an Armenian from Ukraine. There's another one where it's an Armenian from Baku, an Armenian from Karabakh.
Yep.
Can you maybe say something a little bit about, did that ever come up? Did he still remember those people later on in life?
I can't answer that question as far as if you recall it. My mom is and my aunts and uncles are really the keepers of those nitty-gritty details. However, I do want to say something about this as far as Armenians from other parts of the world other than where he was from, is that he was born pre-First Republic.
Right.
Then he encountered the First Republic. Then he encountered communism. So his kind of view on trust issues when it came to other Armenians was a little bit skewed based on his experience, especially being ratted out by one of his own people. However, throughout the book, whether they're from the Ukraine, whether they're from Baku, whether they're from Tiflis, he still had a sense of, we're in this together, we're Armenians. He would always ask about, I'm an Armenian, help me out. So there was still that element of kind of ethnic pride of nationalism, even in the face of him being really outed by a communist Armenian at the time. But as far as recalling any of those people, I think the extent of it, and I could be very wrong here, is actually just in the book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That he kind of got it out. He documented it, and it's not
Yeah.
something he wanted to revisit all the time.
Yep. And he didn't talk really, according to my mom, basically, and some aunts and uncles, he really didn't talk too much about his background very much. He actually, oddly enough, really embraced life. He was very positive, very strict, but very, very positive. And I just don't remember him getting too upset or anything to that effect. But I will tell you one story when it comes to Armenians. And this is an unconfirmed story, so please My grandfather was always looking over his shoulder, according to my mom, was
Mm.
always looking over his shoulder when it came to other Armenians. Even though he had great ethnic pride, member of the church, this, that, whatever. When another High Astansi family kind of moved somewhere around the neighborhood where they lived, one of the gals was some sort of a older teenager, kind of around my mom's age. And the parents said, why don't you go over to this other family and kind of introduce yourself and what have you. And when she came into the house and my grandfather was told, where she was from, according to my mom, with absolutely no hesitation, he said, "Are you here to kill me?"
Wow.
And if you now think about it, as far as the American spy and how we had a lot of Russian spies here, again, also within the Armenian diaspora, you had a couple different parties, what have you. There's another story that I'm not prepared to say at this time. I'll let my mom tell it at another time. But it was very similar, where there was a real concern that somebody was being sent
Yeah.
to kill him because he was so vocal about his experience. And again, this is during the Cold War. There was spy rings here all over the place. So at first you think, okay, this just cannot make sense, until somebody else had mentioned the same thing to my mom and my sister when they were in Germany, visiting the daughter of his best man in the DP camp, who she reconnected with after 70 years, that there was another incident that was very similar. And again, my mom and this woman had never talked about this issue before. So he was always looking over his shoulder,
Right.
and kept Armenians at an arm's length. I mean, he didn't really know English very well. So he was very selective about who he.
That's really interesting, and it connects to the next question I wanted to ask. But before that, I want to say, I think again, taking this very individual, specific story, I think it's symbolic of, I think, thousands and thousands. I mean, I think there was so much unresolved trauma in the Armenian world that I mean, it's actually any wonder that that's all your grandfather kind of, this a couple of incidents of thinking, oh, someone's
Yeah.
there to tell me, considering what so many of these people went through. I'm often kind of amazed at how functional and positive, or but what I wanted the question I wanted to ask, that's kind of connected to this kind of, because what you're talking about also is a little bit of a kind of paranoia, a little bit,
Yep.
and
100%.
that's also connected to two things. One is the kind of just straight up PTSD, just the kind of psycho spiritual
Yeah.
turmoil that these people are put through, that were put through for decades. Um, but also to the way the Soviet Union was constructed. And to this day, as you know very well,
Yeah.
if you live in Armenia, when people visit Armenia, that downtown area where it's very quaint and there's these beautiful, quaint, old sandstone buildings with beautiful courtyards in the middle. And so, well, you very quickly realize that's not made just to be beautiful. That's made so that everyone knows what's going on, and everyone can get onto their balcony and look at it's a panopticon. It's literally
Yeah.
like a
Yep.
prison, actually.
Yep.
It might look quaint and charming, but it's actually built like a prison with a courtyard in the middle of it. And to this day, neighbors do not meddle in each other's business. It's very strange. So if you're living in your apartment might be palatial and absolutely beautiful, but the stairway, the common areas, might be pretty run down and grimy. And there's a weird disconnect
Yeah,
between
there is.
private and the public, and everyone's all in a weird way up in each other's business, but on the other hand they're not, and they're suspicious. So I think it's very interesting that both on the one hand there's a personal element to this, but on the other hand I think that's why these discussions are so important about the period, the Stalinist years, because it's actually continuing. it's not
Yeah,
like,
that paranoia continues. Yeah, no
yeah,
question about it.
I think,
Yeah.
I think that, when the Soviet Union collapsed, I remember being excited and telling my grandfather, I was like, hey, Grandpa, that's it. It happened. All the things you guys wanted since the 60s when you left Armenia, it's done. You can go visit Armenia. You can come and go freely and go see your friends, whatever. And they were like, no, 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 we're not going anywhere. You never know. They might come back.
Mhm. Mhm.
They didn't really believe it until like well into the 90s that
Yep.
the Soviets were not going to come back. Um, there's two questions here from Levon I wanted to ask you. So your grandfather was a displaced person, right?
Yes, he was. Yep.
So Levon is asking, and I wish, because Project Save has some photos of the
Yep.
displaced person camps in Germany, but I it's drew a blank to include them in my slides. He asked, Klagenfurt was a major hub of Armenian refugees at the end of World War II, along with the other DP camp around Stuttgart. Did he get back with the aid of the NCHA?
Um, it's in the book, and I can't remember the acronym there, but there was an organization that did help out. And I will say this name, and I think for people that know the name, George Mardikian
Yeah.
was instrumental in bringing DPs to the United States. For those who don't know who he was probably the first celebrity chef in the United States. And uh, he was working for the U.S. government on nourishment projects. And when he went there, he actually saw the conditions of other Armenians and said, we need to get them out of here.
Yeah.
So Mardikian is actually revered amongst those people that eventually came to the United States and elsewhere. But also on a pretty cool note too, that all organizations, political parties have their ups and downs and strengths and weaknesses. But the ARS was absolutely instrumental. They actually set up and arranged for the family to go from Ellis Island to Chicago and provide them with an apartment. It's the very last sentence in the book, and the person and what have you, and it ends. So yeah, George Mardikian, and I know that UNRWA was also kind of was somewhat involved, United Nations, but that's about the extent of what I know.
Okay. At some point, I think I'll post. We have a few original photos from the camps where the Armenian displaced person, the camps in Germany. Maybe I'll post those on our social
Yep.
next few days.
Which, by the way, I think scholar Gado Hovannessian's wife was, I'm sorry, Richard Hovannessian's wife was from one of the camps in Germany, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay. Carolyn's asking, and this is a good question. So your grandfather's the original manuscript. I'm assuming it was a handwritten
It
manuscript
was.
in Armenian. Does your family have that? Is it in
We
safe?
do.
Okay.
We do. And in fact, the translation, instead of taking it from the Tastian version, which was excellent, my father made a strategic decision, and I was all on board with it, to go ahead and do the translation from the actual manuscript, handwritten manuscript.
That's great. There's another question here, and I did want to talk about this. It's a question I can't quite see where it is now, but it was a question about kind of wondering if and when archives in Russia, Armenia, elsewhere in that region will really fully be opened for people to kind of research and uncover more of these stories. And I would say that I mean, a lot of those archives are open.
Yeah.
However, I would say that, and this is where this is so important to what we do at Project Save Photograph Archive. The National Archive in Armenia, even the Madenataran, the kind of ancient manuscripts archive, and definitely a lot of the archives in Russia and Georgia, they're not all exactly in great shape. The National Archives, it's not it's just, there's an institutional problem in that
Yeah.
part of the world, unfortunately. Whether it's budgeting, whether it's professional development and training, whether it's even caring enough about these things, it's a problem. And I would say with the way things are right now in Armenia, the last number of years, it's the crisis of culture and cultural preservation is, to me, it always has been, even before what happened in 2020. But now I mean, because if you don't have
Yeah.
that, then I don't know what you have in terms of a country's health.
Well,
It's a very serious problem. So yes, a lot of those archives are open. I mean, you can go to Russia and,
yeah.
but are you going to be able to find what you're really looking for? You might not be, because not everything is properly archived. It's not properly stored. It's not properly climate controlled. There isn't always the proper staff with the training to be able to help you and so forth. So this is where organizations like Project Save are
Yes.
absolutely, it's more important than ever what we do right now. But yeah, sorry, Rafi, you were going to.
I would agree. And I think Project Save does kind of it slips under the radar a lot of times, but it in fact has proven over the almost 50 years that it's probably one of the most important organizations, Armenian or not, that exists for people that have some sort of relation to their Armenian background. But I did want to say something about archives really quickly because I found it interesting. Again, Anne Applebaum, Pulitzer Prize winner for the book Gulag, said that, in the 60s and 70s and 80s, the archive access was not really there when it came to the Gulag experience. It was only after the breakup of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, there was a certain period of time, and oddly enough, a lot of those archives were being sold. So you would have people that were worked in the archives, librarians, what have you, that would literally openly sold it. And they sold some archives to Anne Applebaum, and now I think it's at Stanford University, but it's actually closed back up again. And it's weird to me that this Gulag experience is just really not talked about in Armenia at all. We had a colleague that actually was starting to do the first work of Armenians in the Gulag, and I gave her kind of the pre-draft of this particular book, and she was blown away. And I'm like, oh, well, this thing's been around for 60 years. So things are coming around, but there was that little gap when things were being sold off, when there was accessibility in a very perverse way, actually.
Yeah, yeah. And yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, there were many museums, many archives, libraries where people were selling things off on the black market and so forth. So it's a very, institutional health is important everywhere, but in really struggling small countries that are under various amounts of pressure, intense pressure, it's tantamount. If you don't have that kind of institutional fortitude and integrity, it's a serious problem. And what was I going to say? Well, the other thing I wanted to mention is that um, there's a comment here asking, I wonder if somewhere like Shvanidze could be a place for the current displaced persons from Artsakh, from Harappa. And that's a
I don't think
whole
so.
other yeah,
Yeah.
whole other presentation
Yes,
for
it is. Yeah.
other people.
But let me answer that question the best way that I can. Can it? Yes, it can. But I think the time for that to have happened was before. I mean, Armenia is really depopulated in most areas outside of Gyumri and Yerevan, and maybe a little bit of Ghapan. I mean, maybe a little bit there. But also that area is really under some significant pressure right now. And I'm not a political scientist. It's my major, but I'm not a political scientist. But I think it's pretty clear to see that that could be the next battleground. So I'm not 100% sure that that would be a good place for them to go at this time, but certainly it's a great idea. And I think that maybe in other times that would have been a good idea, but I don't know if right now is the right time because you don't want to repeat what just happened.
Yeah, I
In
think that would be the first thing. I mean, I think where Shvanizod and Meghri, that region is, that could very well be the next really contested region. Not to mention, if any kind of turmoil or erupts in Iran, it's literally across the river there.
Yep.
So it's a whole other
Yep.
thing. But also, I think, I think we do sometimes, and I don't mean this person. I think it's a wonderful question. It's a
Good
logical,
idea.
it's a
Yeah.
logical question. Technically, they could live there, yeah. But I do think we do have to keep in mind that Armenians themselves in Armenia
Mm.
leaving the country. So people from Karabakh, they just went through an unbelievable nightmare.
Or, yeah.
Yeah, so most of those people are not going to want to go to the fringes in these abandoned villages. They're not going to want to go through that again. And
Yeah.
from all accounts from the ground over there, I think, as Raffi said, I think that time has passed. So hopefully the government can think of some other ways to make these people's lives, to help them put their lives back together. Um, legal. I think now we're getting into, questions that are beyond Raffi and I, but, are the current successor republics like Russia, Armenia, Georgia, successors to the collapsed Soviet Union legally liable for the suffering they inflicted?
Arto, I can answer it like this. I mean, it's a great question, yeah. But I think we all probably know by now that fairness and law and things that nature really don't apply to countries that unfortunately don't have a lot of leverage, not a lot of leverage, as we saw with Azerbaijan. I mean, they just committed genocide before our very eyes. And I mean, they were sending buses, Russia was sending buses to bring them as if this was planned. So yeah, I mean, I don't know about the legalities. I'm not a lawyer, but I mean, is there a moral kind of duty to recognize it? Sure, but unfortunately, I don't know if that's realistic. Just gonna be honest.
Yeah, well, that, and also let me give a very concrete example as an answer. Today, there's ethnic cleansing going on in Palestine, and there legal action was taken in The Hague, in the International Court, that found plausible genocide is taking place. Is anything really being done after? I mean, that's kind of symbolically a big deal from the legal standpoint.
Yes.
Doesn't seem to have changed anything. So yeah, unfortunately, I don't know. They should be liable, but or not that they should be. On some level, there probably is liability, but yeah. Um, Thank you so much, everyone. This has been such a wonderful discussion. As I say, this will be uploaded to our website where you can see the other conversations on photography, and it'll also be on our YouTube. I did want to say the book, Under Stalin's Sun, is available on Amazon. Ralph, I think wherever people get their books, I think they can order.
Yes. Yep. Absolutely. Kindle for those who, have gone into the digital sphere. But
Yeah, and
I appreciate everybody coming out. I really do. This is a kind of a heavy topic, but again, I think that it's an important topic in many ways. Arto, thank you, my good friend, for inviting me. Thank you to Ruth, and thanks to Project Save. And what I would say is, if anybody is looking for a worthwhile organization to support, right now I can't think of many more important ones than Project Save. I really mean that. And it doesn't run by itself. So it's that way.
You can go to projectsave.org to check out the other events we have upcoming. And you can also, it is interactive. You can go and you can search our database to look through the many, many, many thousands of photos that we have from around the world. And if you have photographs that you would like us to archive, you see here just through this one presentation why it's so important that these photographs are kept safe. The originals are kept safe, archived, documented, and made shareable so that the Armenian global story not only can be preserved, but live on and reverberate and to hopefully help us maybe have brighter days in the future. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Raffi. Join us again
Thank you.
soon. Check out our website, projectsave.org. Thank you all very much. Good night.
Take care.